Welcome to season 3 of Build and Grow Money Matters, a series dedicated to helping businesses go beyond financial management to achieve growth, resilience, and innovation. Your Story is proud to partner with HSBC for yet another season to carry forward inspiring conversations with trend-setting startups and industry stalwarts who have powered the next phase of growth. Before I move ahead, let me set the context. I'm Vishal Krishna, the business editor at Your Story, of course, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to another season of Build and Grow Money Matters. HSBC is the sponsor. Let me introduce my guest today. It's Omkar Shirhatti, co-founder and CEO of Karza Technologies. It is a banking business intelligence solution provider. Before founding Karza in 2015, Omkar was with Ernst & Young as a senior consultant, investigating over 100 high-profile business frauds. He launched Karza with a vision to transform the BFSI community by combating rising NPAs and loan frauds with big data analytics, business intelligence, and machine learning. Welcome, Omkar. How are you?
All good, yeah. Thanks a lot for this kind words, yeah.
No, this is amazing. I mean, you were investigating 100 high-profile business frauds. What does that mean?
Right. So essentially, those serves involved in the overall investigation process to identify how basically some of the banks or security market players were cheated, of how money was raised to them and then laundered across multiple businesses and siphoned off, right? So essentially, it's about identifying the overall modus operandi of fraud, how the money was channeled out, follow the trail of money, and then identify or assist the banks or the institutions to take actions against them. So essentially, it used to be just deep dive and think through the fraudulent's mind of how you would execute something like this.
Right. And when you started up, right, the platform Karza Technologies helps in mitigating these threats. Could you throw some light on the kind of frauds witnessed in the financial services industry last year?
Sure. So essentially, you see, there are multiple aspects when you're looking at loan frauds, right? It ranges from minor identity theft, which can happen on a day-to-day basis for a small personal loan or a credit card, to there are billions of dollars worth of high-profile frauds that you would have seen with the kinds of Nirav Modi or Vijay Mallya, which are sort of pretty famous in the news, right? So the scale is pretty vast, and essentially there are different aspects that you look at when you're looking at investigating into these. So although we started off from the vision when we started off Karza, one of the key aspects that we noted was the lack of information or intelligence available with the institutions when they are dispersing. Right? It's usually post facto, where after something has turned bad, you realize, oh, we didn't know this. If we would have known this, we would not have taken this action. And while we used to investigate some of these frauds, it used to take us manually anywhere between 3 to 4 months to piece together the entire intelligence and figure out how exactly things would have happened. And that's where we thought essentially although we are moving ahead in terms of the available technology, the available intelligence. Government itself was moving forward, right, with the entire data.gov initiatives. You had the transparency policies, you had RTI initiatives coming in. So why can't you leverage technology to sort of bring this together and create a much robust platform for the institutions and take a call before sort of they move ahead, right? And the range of frauds is essentially far and wide, right? So one of the most common places that we look at today is identity theft, where you would come in and take facilities in random people's name. You would forge an ID. Say, for example, I can take Vishal Krishna's PAN number and just affix my photograph on top of it and submit and transact on that, right? Once I get the money, I can't be traced anywhere because identity is yours. And if they catch hold of you, you realize, hey, this was somebody else that had done it. So essentially identity theft and impersonation, basically, or falsification of information, right? Where Omkar can come in and say, hey, I work with Infosys. I draw a salary of 50 lakhs. I work with their Bombay office. And essentially, you would come to know that multiple aspects that say something like the email ID given as official ID instead of infosys.in or infi.in, they would have given infosys.net. Omkar at infosys.net is my official mail. Right? On the face of it, it looks genuine, but it's not. Right? So essentially, some of these smaller aspects also come into play, where you're forging your identity or your employment or source of income and so on and so forth. To it ranges in the high ticket size, where we have seen a lot more cases coming in of falsification of assets. I'm putting a plot or a property as mortgage, which does not belong to me. or there might be another gain attached to it. And on the larger scale, where we have seen basically where you have multi-crore frauds is predominantly undertaken through shell corporations, where you would basically, as a businessman or a promoter, would float in multiple shell or Benami companies through which money is laundered out. And banks traditionally look for is related party transaction. Is the money going to any of the related parties? And the ironical or the funny part is the banks depend upon the borrower to tell them who the related parties are. So if I'm going to launder money through a business, I'll never disclose, hey, these are my related parties, please monitor them, right? So essentially a lot of money gets laundered through that medium, right? So essentially there was multiple facets at different legs, different products have different types of frauds that have sort of originated. And the whole idea was how you can leverage technology to bring all of this together and deliver to the bank credible red flags or alerts before the actual money goes out, right? So essentially, so that's where we've today compiled intelligence from close to around 800 to 900 different origins, cleansed that, sanitized it, stitched it all together, where we today provide credible intelligence on close to 25 million businesses out of the 75 million population that you have of entities in the country, to bring together this intelligence and also sanctions in terms of that. Because another major reason why frauds also go undetected is because of lack of transparency within departments. Income tax will release a separate list of fraudulent businesses. On the other side, SFIO has a separate list. GST would have its own list. Banks, they maintain their own separate list, right? At a given point of time, as an assessor or a risk assessment personnel or a underwriter, I don't have access to all of these sanctions at one place. I might end up giving a loan to a party and then realize, okay, the entity had defaulted somewhere else. And that could have come in from court records or income tax had flagged and of reds flagged. But essentially, since all of this is not at one place, it becomes difficult to sort of screen manually through 600-700 different sources, right? So that's where basically we brought it all together. So in an instant, within less than 400 to 500 milliseconds now, you can screen a business through all of these 100, 200 odd sanctions and also get an understanding about the overall profile and any risks associated with them.
That's a wonderful answer, because that's so succinct. It makes me understand why products like yours are important, especially when money is going out of a bank to an entity.
Right.
How do you know you've collected data that you know, but what beyond that? How is the money going to go into other companies? The person taking money from a bank may have 7 or 8 other companies, like you mentioned. They can be fake companies or Benami companies. Right. And it's an interesting point to segue into how do you do that? How do you structure that, right? I mean, one is we talk about due diligence and how it's evolved over the years, right? And the processes involved in vetting and understanding risk management, right? One is insulating ourselves, but the interesting story here for me is how you do that. How you can come and sell a package saying you put in our solution and everything works, but you go into the DNA of the organization, right? How does a bank actually measure against risk management, right? You do that,
right? Absolutely. So essentially, one of the first aspects that we had to dwell down deep into is exactly understand how the bank functions, right? From outside, you won't realize the kind of machinery that goes behind a bank when you submit an application. On the face of it, you just see, hey, one of our customer service executives will get back to you as the message once you apply. And all you interface is with the RM or the business guy that is your relationship manager that is dealing with you. But behind, essentially, there is operations team that enters or punches your application data. There is a risk team that looks at basically some of the risk flags or their historical learnings. There is a fraud assessment team that has to look at a different facet about your profile. There is a credit operations team that is going to punch in your financial data. There is a credit team which looks at your ability to pay, how much you're earning, how much you're eligible to borrow. There is compliance team involved to check in these monitoring flags which have been instructed by RBI. That is basically you have your legal team looking at the entire documentation, vetting, and so on and so forth. The policy team overall will dictate how the process has to function. The amount of departments across the bank, across the products that they have, is so complicated that it's not very easy to sort of just revamp the overall system, right? It's a dream that you can just take a click and basically you have entire system revamped, but that may not happen. So essentially the approach that we had to take over the last 4 or 5 years, just take one department, one process at a time and build one service at a time. So today over a period, we have built close to around 260 to 270 microservices that take care of each individual aspect, automate that process, add a layer of intelligence and help in the decisioning process. Right? So essentially it has to be a slightly more, patient process to work with them. Right from the beginning, understanding everything that they do, and then work with them department by department. And the further aspect or challenge comes in is that no two banks are same. Right? Each organization, each bank, each NBFC has their own risk appetite as well. Right? Some people might want to take a higher degree of risk and go after certain cases. The other banks may say, hey, this is too risky for me, I'm not going to lend. So each one of them has a different eligibility policy. Each one of them has a different underwriting policy basis their own appetite to take risk. So that's where we have to plug in and work with them at each stage. So how can we work with the policy and say, first plug in at the gate itself. When Omkar Shirhatti is coming and applying, then and there in a few seconds, check whether he's even eligible to go through the balance process or not. Weed out majority of the bad ones, which you know. So essentially the way I try to classify businesses or individuals as fraudsters is into 3 buckets. There are whites, there are grays, and there are blacks. Right. So complete black, this is a shell corporation, it, right? It's a defaulter, it. So those are basically clear blacks, objective calls. Those you can just straight off filter out at the initial stage. Then move to the next stage and try to decipher this gray portion, whether it is actually white or is it black. So you have to touch base on each section, each department, and then we had to work with them through the process. And not just stop at basically the dispersal, right? So even if a loan is given, our job doesn't stop there. Right? So essentially there are organizations that might paint a very rosy picture at the beginning, but then turn bad later. Right? So we have to also work with the entire monitoring aspect, where we have to periodically recheck whether the organization is in the same shape as it was when you lent, or is it turning bad. So it's essentially, if I were to take an analogy from LIC, it's loan ke saath bhi and loan ke baad bhi.
Yes, that's a very well made point. I'm sure that when we put this video out, people would want to know, why haven't you tied up with investigative agencies,
Right.
forensic accounting companies? But you yourself are a forensic accounting stack for me, right? If I deploy you as Karza, Karza is a forensic accounting software in many ways, right? I get to know immediately who has a history of defrauding banks, or who has a history of having several companies. But the trail, right? The trail. Do you have to work with investigative agencies for this trail to be captured on your platform?
Absolutely. So essentially, investigative agencies also will then end up consuming some of the intelligence that we provide, right? So essentially, even when you're getting into an investigation, and I say if you have to look at thousands and lakhs of transactions that would have happened to an entity, you need a direction, right? You can't just chase every possible transaction and try to figure out, right? So you need to weed out some of the false positives and then concentrate on a few. So we work both with private, and now basically we are foraying into assisting even the government authorities into this, where essentially assisting in them in terms of giving their entire investigation a direction and giving them a right places to look for. So we work with Big Fours and other investigative agencies like EY, Alvarez Marshall, and so on and so forth. So some of these we have worked in the past, where we work with their investigation teams, help them with the credible intelligence, and then basically help shape the overall investigative process forward. Because you can't be completely digital in a large investigation. You need people on ground, you need some manual intervention as well. So, but those humans need a direction of which are the transactions to deep dive into, or which are the parties where I have to go and check physical locations, right? So you might get into a scenario basically, especially in shell corporations. I might state that I have a manufacturing facility at XYZ location. When you visit that, it might not even exist, or it might belong to somebody else. We have seen frauds even like those where Basically, there was a funny incident where there were two manufacturing companies, and one of them wanted to a loan of a larger size. They wanted to show more capacity. So they just connected with the other guy. For one day, we want your manufacturing facility. And they just changed the board, dispersed basically their branded plastic bags everywhere, and showed the other unit is also ours.
How did he catch them? Oh, that is like classic. I've seen this happen in many cases.
Right. And even in that stock that would be given as loans, collateral, that would be also double. Effectively, if you look at it, those are kept in gunny bags.
So you're basically getting a higher loan and then you siphon off that loan.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So you double the stock, you double the capacity, everything happens. And it also happens vice versa. When the other guy wanted a facility, this guy gave his facility to him, and then they basically
reciprocal altruism. It's true.
Right. So essentially,
scratching each other's backs. That's so true.
So essentially, these places you need that physical visit, right? So you need to also have a surprise visit by someone to identify certain cases. So then we have to work with some of the investigative agencies, provide them leads which they can go forward. And now we are exploring working ways with the GST department who's looking at. So you might be hearing a lot of news around fake invoicing, fake input credit, or invoice hawala as they call it. Basically, these are entities used. For example, if I want to jack up my sales, I want to impress certain investors, I want to impress the bankers, showing a spectacular growth rate. I can just issue invoices to some of these entities and show fake sales, right? Similarly, if I want to save on my tax, I want to jack up my expenses and I want to show a loss because I don't want to pay taxes on it. I can also get fake purchase invoices for it. So some of these entities are basically purely their whole job is to issue invoices and buy invoices, nothing else, right? So GST department has interest in those. Basically, when you're looking at income tax, they are looking at benami entities, money laundering businesses. So over the years, what we have also built is an algorithm that helps detect patterns of various shell corporations and how a shell entity behaves differently than a genuine one. So over a period, basically, we have now identified close to around 70 to 80,000 such shell corporations that exist and are active in the country today. And then we are now looking to work with the authorities as well, how this can benefit them.
Okay. Is this part of your identify services? And how do you do it? I mean, you look at credit scores, various databases. Is that how you then benchmark things and understand?
There are different, So there are different signs or hints that you can get, right? Basically, it's not just credit scores. There's a high probability a lot of these shell corporations might not even borrow from banks. Yes. They're purely laundering businesses, right? They don't really need credit.
Correct.
So essentially, it's different patterns that emerge, right? So for example, a company is incorporated with 1 lakh capital, no other investment, no investment in plant and machinery, no employees, 0 employee cost. But still at the end of the year with 1 lakh capital, it will report a revenue of 400 crores.
Right.
Which is not humanly possible, right? Even if you're in a genuine business, even if you go and buy worth rupees 1 lakh and you have to sell it, right? It takes time for to receive that 1 lakh and then go buy the next stock. It will take more time. But here you have one company who has churned out that 1 lakh rupees at least every second day or every day throughout the year to churn out a revenue of 400 crores with 0 further capital, 0 stocks, 0 in machinery, right? So that is one of the ways basically it shows that something is wrong here, right? Similarly, you find multiple related patterns, right? So suddenly you will have a completely dud company which has no assets, no investments, nothing, goes ahead and raises money. 1 lakh, basically it will be a share capital with a premium of 100 crores. So why would anyone pay a premium of 100 crores for a company that is completely bare shell, right? And then that money is routed into land or basically investments, which is predominantly your benami holdings. And then you will have random people that you might not even know, right? They will look at the backgrounds about the promoters. Basically, when we look at various multi-crore corporations where directors are, and we look at the residential addresses, they turn out to be in hut number XYZ, ABC Chopad Patti, right? So a person staying in a Jhopalpatti managing, or he's a director in basically a multi-crore corporation. So those kind of signals or hints that we pick up and try to identify and profile businesses to identify give the probability of that entity is a shell. And we had run basically these algorithms. So there were a list of close to around 32,000 odd entities that were even identified by the regulators. The Enforcement Directorate, SFIO, they had published a list of about 32,000 shell companies. And our algorithm could identify 98.5% of those with great accuracy. We could preemptively predict that these are shell.
Wow. Classic tax evasion, classic Benami movement.
Right.
You mentioned it's actually, is it easy to uncover such big puzzles in these systems, right? It's interesting. India has a very good history of regulation, right? Yet we find it very difficult. Like you said, a company with 1 lakh in investment showing 400 crores of turnover, that must be a superhuman company. That can be a unicorn, right? And then what? I mean, it's humanly not possible. Is it because bank managers are unable to manage and understand these things, or even companies that track fraud, government agencies cannot humanly verify these things? Is that so? Your clients in these cases will be government departments, right?
Right, and essentially it also requires a slightly different perspective, right? Essentially, it's more when you're looking at it from while we are doing a chartered accountancy, we were always taught that a chartered accountant is a watchdog.
Yeah.
Right. It's not a bloodhound.
Yeah.
But when you're into investigations, you have to be bloodhounds, where you have to assume that the other guy is a crook and then think from that perspective. So you don't take any intelligence for granted, right? As basic as, for example, we go to minutest details of what was the email ID used to incorporate this company. Right? And when we did that, we realized that there are close to around 84,000 companies registered using fake email IDs.
Wow.
Some of them basically are email ID itself says fakeproof@gmail.com. That is the email ID used to register the business. Now, these smaller elements are overlooked, right? So essentially, when you're looking at it from an underwriters or investigative agency's perspective, it's also humans that are undertaking that. And to a great extent, the modus or basically your thought process of how do you approach an investigation greatly depends upon your own experience. The more experienced you are, the more number of scenarios you have seen, will you be able to connect a few dots and identify that anomaly, which not every person would be able to, right? And hence there is also a difference between an investigation undertaken by different individuals of the same department. Within a bank, it might also happen that if it would have gone to a credit manager X, he or she might have rejected it. But it went to Y, who was slightly less experienced, he could have overlooked those things. So there's a lot of human element and assessment or judgment involved, as well as basically their understanding of these minute aspects, right? So through the system, what also happens is you're standardizing that process and bringing the best possible inference or indicators that you can, which sort of normalizes this process and this scam.
Wow, I mean, you can write a book with this, and it's a phenomenal. I'd love to personally sit with you and talk about these things. It is phenomenal, and I'm also happy that a company like you is involved because I think you've helped a lot of KYC verifications, right? Like you said, right? People using my photograph in a fake Aadhaar, and I'm sure that kind of product is received very well today too.
Absolutely. So essentially, that becomes the very first step, right? If you are not who you claim to be, the ensuing process is a waste of time, right?
Yes.
So essentially, the KYC verification, the identity check, and ensuing red flags are the core to every piece of application that you get in. Okay. So essentially, that is today we process anywhere between 2.2 crore documents and transactions per month. For across the entire base of customers that we deal with, right? So essentially that becomes, or that's an integral part of every application that would come through. And it's not just about the applicant or the business, but then you have to look at the identities of the promoters, the directors, and so on and so forth. So it's an ensuing band of every applicant, co-applicant, guarantor, and so on and so forth. Every party has to be vetted. to check whether they are who they are claiming to be, and then proceed further. And the kind of frauds that are emerging essentially is slightly scaring at times, because
It is scary.
essentially when you look at something like an Aadhaar or any of these, they're supposedly quite robust, right? But you have scenarios where I can also somehow got hold of your fingerprints. It could be through some of the objects that you touched, etc.
Yeah.
Now, using those fingerprints, I can go to an Aadhaar center and edit your entire profile. So it's not only on the document, I can go and update in the database and change your photograph to mine. So even when bank does a UIDI verification, they would get my photograph instead of yours, which they consider it's genuine, right? So here, how do you tackle these frauds? Basically because if you look at it, there was a time when an ID, a user ID for a UIDI system was available for sale. Right? So those were the kind of types where you can even go ahead and revamp or change anyone's identity to anything, because that is what you consider as sacrosanct document. So here basically we have to also not only then check whether the given person's identity on the document is valid or not, but how do you go back and check the history? Because as a fraudster, I might know what is there on the piece of paper. I might not know your history or your background, where you come from. So those kind of elements have to be added to make this process slightly more robust. So every day we have to sort of upgrade our systems to tackle new types of frauds and new types of scenarios and bring out a solution that will help the institutions in that.
It's interesting if they can break my Aadhaar identity. That's a digital kind of fraud, right? And for them to do that, how do they break it? I mean, they get a physical copy of my email ID and so then go in and do it.
So the most simplest part is basically just change the document, right? So you have a copy in front of you.
Yeah, that's easy.
I just paste my photograph on top of it, take a photocopy of it, and do
Correct.
And that also for the other institutions was slightly difficult, because UIDAI's authentication facility was made available now only to banks, insurance companies. So as an NBFC or as a private platform, if you're trying to verify that, you don't have access to the APIs of UIDAI. So you need to have direct and direct methods, right? So there, essentially the next stage is to validate the QR code. Now, some cases, basically people also started creating a separate QR code and then basically validating through that. Or some people might say QR code nahi hai, purana card hai, wahan par QR code nahi tha, which is still an acceptable document, right? You can just use an Aadhaar which did not have a QR code. The second essentially is slightly more advanced, which might happen, extremely remote cases of that happening, but people do that. Or it might be plain simple identity theft as well. Both of us, if they share the same name, right? If both of us are Vishal Krishna, and now, for example, there are NBFCs who provide loans specifically to CAs or doctors. Right? If you're a doctor, just take away the loan. If you're a chartered accountant, take 25 lakhs, no questions asked. But I'm not a chartered accountant, but I know another chartered accountant who has my same name, who's also Omkar Shirhatti. I am also Omkar Shirhatti. So I can just go ahead and say, okay, this is my identity. This is why I'm Omkar Shirhatti. I am that chartered accountant. Right? So because there is no linkage between these. A CA registration may not have the linkage to my PAN or to my Aadhaar. I can just say I am that same Omkar Shirhatti. Right? So those kind of things also happen. The other extremely advanced one is basically where somebody is able to get your biometrics. If I get hold of your biometrics somehow, I can go to an Aadhaar center, enter those biometrics, and edit my profile. So you can edit your face, photograph, you can edit your mobile number, etc. So all of those things can be changed basis your biometrics only. So UID is pretty secure from that perspective. Not every Tom, Dick and Harry can just walk into an Aadhaar center and forge an identity. But essentially, if you have to do it, and basically people will also do it when there is a lot of money involved, right? Where it will warrant it. So essentially, even if one or two cases like this happen, it will be going to be for a very large sum of money.
I envy your position in society today, because it's a very special time to be in the investigative side, because people are going to be ever so creative. People have been creative in fraudulent practices, and I'm sure that digitally it's even going to be even more challenging. And
absolutely.
And is it really surging in terms of digital identity theft, digital benami? I mean, like you said, I mean, companies can be registered digitally today, and can money move through these Benami companies digitally? Obviously, people will not come and verify where you're staying or whatever, right? Because people are creating multiple companies. In the old days, they went to a
Right.
chartered accountant, but today you
Right.
create a company online itself. It is possible,
Right.
right? We're
Right.
talking about the era of neo banking and all that. So it's a very
Right.
dangerous time then.
I understand, but definitely there are also controls that are being put by the authorities. So it's all so if you look at the overall graph of some of such corporations registered over a period of time, there was a massive surge that was seen from 2007 till 2012, 13 in terms of such businesses coming up. But over a period of time, the kind of actions or curtails of regulations that the government is also putting in. For example, GST was one of the biggest aspects that came into play. The second essentially was from the Ministry of Corporate side, right? Earlier, I could just go ahead and register the company and I have to submit some physical documents, which was never verified. Now it is mandatory for every director to also undertake a thorough KYC with the authorities. They made people actually take photographs of the director, had to upload a photograph sitting in the office on his desk and capture the location. Hey, my office is here. They had to take photographs along with the nameplate of the company and then upload it to MCA. So all of these aspects, the government also started creating these initiatives. GSTN is undertaking a drive to verify every location and contact number. So this has curtailed it down. So there was a time basically where we have seen close to around 8,200 shell corporations registered in one single month, right? Which
In
is
12, 13,
now,
in 12 and
yeah,
13, I think.
yeah. So in one single month, there were close to 8,000 odd businesses registered, right? Shell corporations, which today on average is down to around 8 to 900
How
is
do they
what we
still
see.
manage it? How do they still manage it with all the GST
It's,
checks in place?
Absolutely. So essentially, see, some of these are because they keep on shuffling, right? Because you will continuously have changes of names, you will have change of locations. And 1 month I'm on this address, second month I'll be somewhere else, third month somewhere else. The directors also keep on rotating. Today, basically, you and me would be
Or
directors.
you're
Tomorrow
launching
there would be
multiple new companies with GST, treat them
right.
as failures every 6, 7 months.
Absolutely. And then basically you have somebody else coming in as directors, and then basically somebody else will be a director, and then they'll keep on rotating locations. So that still happens. So you'll have that chain of, there's a lot of effort involved in it, but if you have to do it, you people do it, right? So
Yeah.
essentially they will find ways to get
I'll obviously get in touch with you after this. There's so much to discuss. Let's also
right.
talk about COVID-19. How did you handle your
Sure.
team? What kind of digital adoption did you notice with businesses? Did you
Sure.
yourself do any tech upgradation of cloud services or sign up with any cloud services to scale up?
So we have been ourselves have been cloud first always, right? So essentially we never had a physical bare shell server environment. It's always been on cloud. Rather, we have now diversified across clouds, across various regions. But the COVID-19 has been rather a boon for us. It acted as the digital transformation officer on our behalf for various institutions. There were 2, 3 different aspects, right? So one is definitely organizations came or realized the importance of digitization, which was earlier sort of thought as a good to have platform or a good to have set of technology, which has suddenly became mandatory or the need of the hour, right? So essentially there was a massive influx coming in from that side. But on the other side, fraud risk and basically other attributes also became slightly more critical on the other side, because since the business was not that great, a majority of the banks and financial institutions started looking inwards in terms of what they can better. And that's where basically the focus also went on in terms of curtailing fraud and risk, right? Because COVID also saw a surge in terms of non-contactable borrowers. It saw a surge of delayed payments. And that's where the attention went back to the risk and fraud curtailment processes, which sort of always took a back seat as compared to business. The first priority for any institution is always going to be how can I grow my business further? How can we disperse more? How can we onboard more customers? The risk and fraud check always they sort of take a back seat. And since the business was a bit low during this period, suddenly the attention went back to these processes, which again worked in our favor, sort of to work with them to build solutions around that and implement these. Okay. So during this period itself, we would have onboarded about close to 65 to 70 new customers. We hired close to around 100 people now post-COVID. So the team size has also grown tremendously, basically the number of products that we are working on, as well as the number of clients that we are working on. So working with others. So essentially it has definitely worked in our favor to sort of finally, to realize the importance or the criticality of some of the solutions that we propose. Right?
No, absolutely. And with that, they'd also probably, not underestimate the role of automation. And I wanted you to talk about automation in terms of also managing your own risks and investments. And how does automation and risk management feature in your financial decisions? A bit tricky question. One is why industry should look at automation seriously, which they are.
Sure.
They've gone digital, but I'm sure they look at AI automation more seriously. And how does your company or how do you use automation to manage risk?
So essentially from our side, definitely is we have to, it would be sort of ironical if we don't use our own systems to assess the customers that we are extending access to.
That is so true.
So essentially every business has to utilize it, right? So essentially it's not just banks or NBFCs that are taking financial or lending decisions. Every business that is dealing with some other entity has to undertake somehow their risk assessment, right? For example, if I'm selling to someone, the person has to pay me for that service, right? And I need to know the capability of the other party to decide whether I should charge a prepaid or whether I should give them 30 days credit or a 60 days credit, right? That assessment also every business guy or every shopkeeper might be taking today in terms of this. So essentially, and to help you sort of digitize some of these processes is helpful, right? So even other elements, right, where we use digitization, right, from your GST filings, so income tax return filings, fetching of those, monitoring of those transactions, monitoring the performance of our vendors, right? Are they paying their GST on time? Because once they pay GST, I'll get the input credit.
Yes.
If not, I have to pay interest on top of that. So even these smaller elements sort of are integral part of a business that you manage on a day-to-day basis, and that has to be thoroughly automated. So that's where we ourselves then utilize the GSP services or GST APIs. We leverage on income tax APIs, monitor all of these transactions, and then reconcile and manage it from the other side. So essentially, for us, essentially, we have been more or less pretty stingy in terms of how we manage our money. If you look at it, till now, we would not have raised humongous or large sums of money. For us, essentially, the first principle always, when we started Karza, one of the base fundamental principles that me and Gaurav had set was that we are here to earn money and not burn money.
That's true. That's a great message to entrepreneurs.
Right. So essentially for us, the aim always has been how profitable can we become and how we can create a self-sustaining organization. Whatever we would have raised either would have been for a rainy day capital or a jumpstart, which would have been way back in 2017 and 19, right? So we always had to ensure the great capital efficiency and then let the earnings and let your clients pay for your next set of growth and the new products that you have done.
No, I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you say that. So for you, this is like you practice what you preach. That's what you're saying. That's very important. Go on.
Right. So essentially, if you look at it today, historically, the entire growth and expenses at Karza have been funded 90% through our revenues and 10% through the funding that we would have received till date. So, and that is basically has to reduce over a period of time. So essentially, managing that churning and reinvesting into the overall business is slightly critical. And that ensures basically you are continuously on your toes, thinking about new problem statements, thinking about building the next set of products, because I can't let my money sit idle and earn an interest on FD. Right? So essentially the best way I can grow my money is build new solutions, build new products and ship it out in the market and let that revenue fuel my next set of growth. So that's basically the core problem, the philosophy that we rather follow at Karza.
That's nice. So, but for companies, automation is here. They have to embrace it, right?
Right. Absolutely. So essentially, automation runs right from basically managing the overall billing of how much has to be billed to which customers, how the invoices are raised, how do you collect money, how do you reconcile that, how do you file your dues. there is a thorough automation involved because administrative costs at times take a toll, right? Essentially, you can't have a lot of those. So essentially for us anyways, always cloud first. We built our own customer management portal. We built our own billing modules. We have built our own statutory filing modules internally and leveraging on some of the APIs that are either extended by the government authorities or by our service providers, right? So essentially it makes the journey a lot more smoother, and it gives, and from basically then automated MISs that can be sent to your investors or to yourself. There is also an automated intelligence available to the business development teams of which client is performing how, which are the people that you need to touch base with, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of efficiency that creates in once you start automating some of your processes and move beyond Excel files or basically Word docs that you might have.
Well said. Well said. This is also a show called Money Matters. So, I think a lot of people would appreciate all this that you just said. But how do you look at managing and growing your money?
For me, essentially my own money. Essentially, when you're all invested into your own business, essentially it's that does the overall money making for you.
The 90% that you make goes into your own products, right? That the money pays for the products in your company.
Right. And essentially for me, if you ask my own personal philosophy, it's either go big or nothing, right? So essentially for me, it's not about, I won't be a person that would invest $1,000 every month into mutual funds and SIPs and so on and so forth. Yeah. So essentially for me, it is make tons of money one go and never work again. So essentially the area where I would personally be working towards essentially is be a scenario where I don't have to work to earn money, right? Let the money earn itself over a period of time.
Absolutely.
The moment you work to earn, you're obligated. And once you have that obligation, you have to continue to do that, and you can't do things that you truly want to really do in your life. So essentially, till the time that obligation is not present to earn money, then basically everything else is available for you to live your own life.
That's a very good, phenomenal answer. That you shouldn't be obligated to your work. That you should enjoy the journey. And I'm sure that's where you're all in. And I'm glad you didn't say that it's money, or you're a gambler in terms of saying that I want to work so hard that I enjoy it and money pays. That money comes by itself.
Right.
Well said. Okay, this is the last question. Okay, and
Sure.
I know that Indian banks and startups have always, there hasn't been a great understanding. But the best thing is they're trying now, and they're, So, what are your expectations from lenders and banks for business? What are your expectations?
There would be, although there is definitely a tremendous improvement that we are seeing from banks in terms of their outlook and the kind of initiatives that they are taking, right? But some of the expectations would be on both sides. One is essentially, since we work with banks, they are also our customers and partners to a great extent. One of the aspects is there's still some improvement required into the overall perception about working with startups, right? So if you look at even PSUs or major private sector banks, they need to be slightly more pro-risk working with new entities, new ventures, and not just brush them off because maybe they are a new startup, maybe started 6 months or 1 year down back, and so on and so forth, right? It's definitely, if you give opportunities to players like us, when we started off, we were still grateful to some of those NBFCs or banks that took bet on us and basically worked with us in the initial days, right? So that helped us prove our mettle and basically then move forward, right? So essentially be open to some of those initiatives and not just brush off any startup just because, hey, they are just 6 months old or 1 year old or something like that, right? So essentially that is definitely need to have, that's a bit improvement on that perception. And be open to work with new ventures, new startups, and try out different technologies. And one of the other aspects that somehow we feel that we were able to do better, or we were able to slightly think out of the box, is because none of the founders come from banking industry. We come from outside the banking industry. And when we are looking at it as an outsider, we are not blocked by, or we are not bogged down by
Yeah.
the tradition processes or basically set mindsets about, yeah, aise hi hona chahiye, so, right? That's where when you come from outside, you start questioning, why can't it happen this way? Why can't it happen in XYZ manner, right? So when you start questioning those and give those alternatives, that opens up a completely different angle or a dimension to it and brings about solutions that a set mindset might not have thought of. So essentially, that's one of the aspects, to be open from that perspective and not just look at the credentials of have you worked in a bank before and so on and so forth, right? So that's one aspect. And second, from industry side, basically, from as a consumer of banking services, definitely what we look for is support in majority of the other aspects, right? So when we're looking at collections, when we're looking at managing our finances, expense management, vendor payouts, etc. So there's a lot more work to be done in terms of the services that are being provided to businesses or corporates over a period that might come through the neo banking platforms and so on and so forth. But banks' own systems need to be sort of more robust or more advanced in terms of the kind of MIS insights or the dashboards that we need, rather than just going and downloading a statement and taking this analysis in an Excel. It would be great if I have a dashboard and the bank itself provides me some of those insights on top of the statements, over and above maybe the credit facilities and so on and so forth. So that is basically on the other side. Definitely there is a time to revamp the overall banking dashboard or the login page that you see and how those insights are made, right? So those definitely one aspect in terms of not just your traditional banking, how you can add value on top of that. On the other side, from a client perspective, I would say be open to ideas. Right? So don't basically be rigid in that mindset of things have to happen in a certain way until unless it's regulatory. I can't argue on that point, right? So essentially, but have open mind when you're working with new ventures.
Kicking off the season 3, right, has been phenomenal for me, simply because this has been a worthwhile conversation for me to explore several stories. And I'm sure entrepreneurs and banks listening to you, right, they would realize the importance of understanding fraud in a digital era, right, guys? There's some facts, right? They've actually saved, frauds worth 3,000 crore plus. Correct me if I'm wrong, Omkar. And you've got 250 clients, and which is phenomenal. And I wish you all the best in this journey. And I'm sure this last statement that you made, that just because you're a 6-month-old startup, please don't brush them away. Embrace them. Mentor them, give them a chance. And like you see it right here, we've seen Omkar do it with Karza Technologies with his co-founders. So thank you so much for your time to be on the show, and I'll see you soon.
Definitely. Thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot for letting me share some of these stories. It's been great fun.